I found out my propane tanks were sitting on HOA property at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, when a woman in a pristine white pantsuit marched up my driveway with a tape measure and a clipboard that she wielded like a weapon. My name is Patrick Graham, and I had been living peacefully in the Meadowbrook Estates community in Charlotte, North Carolina for almost 8 years. I bought my property back in 2018, a nice 3-bedroom house on the edge of the development with enough land to feel like I had some breathing room. The propane tanks had been there since day one, installed by the previous owner to heat the workshop behind my house. I used propane for my backup heating system, my water heater, and occasionally for the grill when I felt like cooking outside. Those two 500-gallon tanks had sat in the same spot for over 15 years according to the paperwork I got when I closed on the house. "Excuse me," the woman called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Are you Patrick Graham?" I looked up from the lawn mower I was working on. The carburetor had been giving me trouble all morning, and I had grease up to my elbows. "That's me. Can I help you?" She adjusted her designer sunglasses and gave me a look that suggested she had just stepped in something unpleasant. "I'm Wendy Wilkins, president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board. We need to discuss your propane tanks immediately." I wiped my hands on a rag and walked over. Wendy Wilkins was probably in her mid-50s, with blonde hair that looked professionally styled and enough jewelry to stock a small boutique. She had that particular expression that some HOA board members develop over time, a mixture of self-importance and barely contained irritation at the world for not conforming to their vision. "What about them?" I asked, nodding toward the tanks that sat on a concrete pad about 20 feet from my property line, surrounded by a neat wooden fence I had built myself 3 years ago. Wendy pulled out her tape measure with a flourish that would have been impressive in a different context. "According to the HOA bylaws, no structures or equipment can be placed within 15 feet of the community property line. Your tanks are currently sitting 12 feet from the line." I blinked. "Those tanks have been there for 15 years. I bought this house with them already installed." "That may be," Wendy said, making a note on her clipboard. "But the previous owner was also in violation. We're conducting a comprehensive review of all properties in the community, and yours is one of several that need to come into compliance." "Comprehensive review," I repeated. "Let me guess. You just got elected president." Her smile was colder than my freezer. "I was elected 6 months ago, yes, and part of my platform was ensuring that all residents follow the rules that keep our community beautiful and our property values high." I had heard about Wendy Wilkins. My neighbor Tom had mentioned her at a barbecue last summer, said she had been campaigning for the HOA presidency like she was running for Congress. Apparently, she had moved into Meadowbrook Estates about 2 years ago and had immediately started attending every HOA meeting, taking notes, and generally making it known that she thought the previous board was too lenient. "Okay," I said slowly. "So what exactly are you asking me to do?" "I'm not asking," Wendy corrected. "I'm informing you that you have 30 days to relocate those propane tanks to a position that complies with HOA regulations. If you fail to do so, you'll be fined $500, with an additional $200 per week until the violation is corrected." My jaw tightened. "That's going to cost me thousands of dollars. I'll need to hire a propane company, pour a new concrete pad, possibly run new lines to my house. We're talking about at least $5,000 or $6,000. Wendy's expression didn't change. "That's not the HOA's concern. You agreed to follow the bylaws when you purchased your property. The rules are the rules, Mr. Graham." She handed me a formal notice that had been printed on expensive-looking letterhead, turned on her heel, and walked back to her pristine white Lexus SUV that probably cost more than my annual salary as a mechanical engineer. I stood there looking at the notice, feeling my blood pressure rise. The thing was, I had read the HOA bylaws when I bought the house. I had them in a folder somewhere in my office, but I had never seen anything about a 15-foot setback for propane tanks. Most HOA rules focused on things like fence heights, paint colors, and lawn maintenance. That evening, I dug through my files until I found my copy of the original HOA bylaws from 2018. I spent 2 hours reading through every page, and there it was, buried in Section 7, Subsection D, Paragraph 3. No exterior equipment, structures, or utility installations shall be placed within 15 feet of community common areas or property lines. But here was the interesting part. When I looked at the survey I had gotten when I bought the house, the area where my propane tank sat was actually marked as being on my property, not community property. The property line, according to the survey, ran along a drainage ditch that was a good 30 feet past where my tank sat. The next morning, I called the surveying company that had done my original survey. They were still in business, and after some digging through their records, they confirmed that my tanks were well within my property boundaries. I paid them $300 to come out and do a new survey, just to make absolutely certain. 2 days later, a surveyor named Mike Chen showed up with all his equipment. He spent about 3 hours taking measurements, checking old boundary markers, and comparing everything to the county records. When he was finished, he showed me his findings on his laptop. "Your tanks are definitely on your property," Mike confirmed. "They're about 18 feet from the actual property line, which runs along that drainage ditch. I'm not sure what the HOA is looking at, but they're wrong." I thanked him and got the official survey results in writing. Then I made copies and sent one to Wendy Wilkins via certified mail, along with a polite letter explaining that my propane tanks were in full compliance with HOA regulations because they were on my property, not near any community property line. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A week later, I got another letter from the HOA. This one informed me that they had done their own survey, and according to their findings, the community property line actually extended to include the drainage ditch and the land on both sides of it. Therefore, my tanks were in violation, and the 30-day clock was still ticking. I called the HOA management company, an outfit called Premier Community Services that handled the day-to-day operations for about 50 different HOAs in the Charlotte area. I got transferred 3 times before I finally reached someone who could actually discuss my case. Her name was Jessica, and she sounded tired. "Mr. Graham, I understand your frustration," Jessica said, "but the HOA board has the authority to interpret the bylaws and the property boundaries. If you disagree with their findings, you can request a hearing before the board." "And when would that be?" "The next board meeting is in 3 weeks. My 30 days will be almost up by then." "I understand, but that's the process." I hung up and called a real estate attorney named David Chen, who had helped me with the closing when I bought my house. David listened to my story, looked over the surveys, and shook his head. "Patrick, here's the thing," David said when we met at his office. "HOAs have a lot of power, but they don't have the power to arbitrarily redefine property lines. The county has the official plat maps, and those determine where your property ends and community property begins. If your survey is accurate, and I have no reason to think it isn't, then the HOA is wrong. So what do I do? Go to the board meeting. Present your case. If they still insist you're in violation, then you might need to consider legal action, but that gets expensive fast." Sometimes it's cheaper to just move the tanks, even if you're right. I didn't like that answer, but I understood it. The problem was, I wasn't the type to back down when I knew I was right. Maybe that was stubborn, maybe it was stupid, but it was who I was. The board meeting was held in the community clubhouse on a Thursday evening. About 30 residents showed up, most of them there for other issues. Wendy Wilkins sat at the head table with 4 other board members, all of them looking official and self-important. When my turn came, I stood up and presented my survey, explaining clearly and calmly that my propane tanks were on my property and therefore not in violation of any HOA rules. I had prepared handouts with maps and diagrams. I thought I made a pretty compelling case. Wendy listened with an expression that suggested she was barely tolerating my presence. When I finished, she didn't even look at the materials I had provided. "Mr. Graham, the board has reviewed the property boundaries, and we stand by our assessment. The area where your tanks are located is within the 15-foot setback from community property. You have 2 weeks remaining to comply with our order." "But the county survey clearly shows." "The county survey is outdated," Wendy interrupted. "The community took ownership of the drainage easement area in 2020 through an agreement with the county. That information is available in the HOA records if you care to look." That was news to me. "Can I see that agreement?" "You can submit a formal request to review HOA documents. It takes about 10 business days to process." I felt my temper rising but kept my voice level. "So let me get this straight. You're saying that in 2020, 2 years after I bought my house, the HOA took ownership of land that was previously mine, and now you're telling me I have to move equipment that was legally placed before that change occurred?" "The agreement was properly filed and all residents were notified," Wendy said. "I never received any notification. That's not the HOA's responsibility if you failed to maintain current contact information." Another board member, a man in his 60s named Robert, cleared his throat. "Wendy, maybe we should give Mr. Graham some additional time to review the documentation. This seems like a complicated situation." Wendy shot him a look that could have frozen lava. "The rules are clear, Robert. Mr. Graham has had ample time to comply. If he needs more information, he can follow the proper procedures." She turned back to me. "Do you have anything else to add, Mr. Graham?" I had plenty to add, but none of it would have been productive. I sat down, fuming. After the meeting, Robert approached me in the parking lot. He looked uncomfortable. "Patrick, listen," he said quietly. "Between you and me, Wendy has been pushing a lot of aggressive enforcement lately. Some of us on the board think she's going too far, but she's got 2 other members who always vote with her, so she's got the majority." "So what am I supposed to do?" Robert shrugged helplessly. "I wish I had a better answer. Maybe talk to a lawyer, or maybe just move the tanks. I know it's not fair, but sometimes that's the easiest path." I thanked him and drove home, my mind racing. When I got there, I did something I should have done earlier. I went to the county planning office's website and searched for any easement agreements or property transfers involving Meadowbrook Estates in 2020. There was nothing. No agreement, no transfer, no change in property boundaries. The next morning, I called Wendy Wilkins directly. Her number was listed on the HOA website as the contact for the president. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice clipped and professional. "This is Wendy." "Wendy, this is Patrick Graham." I checked the county records, and there's no easement agreement from 2020. There's no record of the HOA taking ownership of any property near my house. There was a pause. "Mr. Graham, I don't appreciate you questioning the board's integrity. The agreement exists. Then show it to me. Submit a formal request through the proper channels." "I'm submitting it now, verbally, as a resident with a right to review HOA documents. Another pause. I'll have the management company contact you about scheduling a time for you to review documents at their office. That's not necessary. You can just email me a copy of the agreement. HOA policy is that document reviews must be conducted in person to protect resident privacy. It's an agreement between the HOA and the county. There's no privacy issue. I've explained the policy, Mr. Graham. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other matters to attend to. She hung up. I sat there staring at my phone, and that's when it hit me. There was no agreement. Wendy was bluffing, and she was banking on the fact that most people wouldn't push back hard enough to call her on it. I spent the rest of the day documenting everything. I made a timeline of all our interactions, collected all the letters and notices, and organized all my survey documents. Then, I sent the entire package to David Chen, my attorney, with a note asking what my options were. David called me back that afternoon. Patrick, I think you've got a strong case that the HOA is overstepping its authority, but here's what I'm worried about. Even if you're right, they can make your life miserable with constant violations and fines for other things. HOA boards have a lot of discretion in enforcement. So I should just give in. I'm not saying that. I'm saying you need to think about whether this is the hill you want to die on. If you want to fight it, I'll help you, but it's going to cost money and stress. I thought about it for a long time that night. I'm not usually a confrontational person. I like to get along with people, keep my head down, do my work. But something about the way Wendy Wilkins had handled this whole situation just stuck in my craw. The arrogance, the dishonesty, the assumption that she could push people around just because she had a title and a clipboard. The next morning, I made my decision. I called the propane company. I need to move my tanks, I told the dispatcher. What's that going to cost? After an inspection and some measurements, they gave me a quote, $6,200. That included draining the tanks, moving them, pouring a new concrete pad, and running new lines to my house. The whole job would take about a week. Where do you want them? The propane company supervisor, a guy named Randy, asked. I pulled out my survey map and pointed to a spot that was clearly on my property, about 40 feet from any possible property line dispute. It was farther from my house, which would mean longer pipe runs and more work. But it would also be unquestionably compliant with any reasonable interpretation of the HOA rules. Right there, I said. Randy looked at the spot and nodded. That'll work. We can start next Tuesday if you want to get this done. Actually, I said, an idea forming. Let me check on something first. I'll call you back tomorrow. After Randy left, I took a closer look at where my propane tanks were currently located. They sat on a concrete pad that I had always assumed was entirely for my benefit. But looking at it more carefully, I noticed something interesting. There were some pipes and conduits running under my fence line, coming from the direction of the community clubhouse. I followed the fence line, looking for where these pipes might lead. About 100 feet away, near the back corner of the community clubhouse property, I found a small utility shed that I had never paid much attention to before. It was painted to match the clubhouse and had a sign that said, "Authorized personnel only." The shed wasn't locked. Inside, I found exactly what I had started to suspect. A large propane-powered backup generator and a secondary heating system for the clubhouse. And the propane lines ran directly from my tanks. I stood there for a long moment, processing this information. Then I pulled out my phone and took about 50 pictures from every angle. When I got home, I called Randy at the propane company back. Randy, quick question. If someone was tapping into my propane tanks without my permission, would I have any liability for that? Randy sounded surprised. Tapping into your tanks? No, you wouldn't have liability. That would be theft of service. Why is someone stealing your propane? I think so. Can you send someone out to check my tanks and see if there are any unauthorized connections? 2 days later, Randy came out personally with another technician. They spent about an hour tracing all the lines from my tanks. When they finished, Randy looked grim. Patrick, you've got about 200 feet of line running off your tanks to that shed by the clubhouse. Based on the gauge readings and your usage history, I'd estimate they've been pulling about 300 gallons a year off your tanks, maybe more. For how long? These connections look old. Could be 10 years, could be 15. Hard to say for sure. I did some quick math in my head. 300 gallons a year at current propane prices over 10 years came out to somewhere around $9,000. Maybe more. Can you document all of this? I asked. Already started. This is a serious issue, Patrick. Someone could have gotten hurt if those lines weren't maintained properly. And yeah, it's definitely theft. I thanked Randy and asked him to send me a full report with pictures and estimates. Then I called David Chen again. David, the situation just got a lot more interesting, I said. When I explained what I had found, David let out a low whistle. Patrick, this changes everything. The HOA has been stealing your propane and now they're trying to force you to move the tanks. That looks really bad for them. So what's my next move? First, get that documentation from the propane company. Second, send a certified letter to the HOA informing them that you're aware of the unauthorized connection and demanding reimbursement. Third, tell them you'll be moving the tanks as requested and that when you do, you'll be disconnecting any unauthorized lines. And if they don't pay, then we file a lawsuit for theft of services, and honestly, we'll probably win. I followed David's advice. I sent a detailed letter to Wendy Wilkins and the HOA board, with copies to the management company. I laid out exactly what I had found, included photos and the propane company's report, and calculated that the HOA owed me approximately $10,000 for stolen propane over the past 10 years, plus interest. I gave them 2 weeks to respond before I moved the tanks. The response came faster than I expected. 3 days later, I got a phone call from a man who identified himself as Gregory Porter, the HOA's attorney. Mr. Graham, I've reviewed your letter and the supporting documentation. I need to inform you that the propane connection you discovered was installed by a previous owner of your property as part of an agreement with the HOA. You assumed responsibility for that agreement when you purchased the property. Show me the agreement, I said. I'll have to retrieve it from the archives. These records go back quite a ways. Take your time. I'm moving my tanks next week, so you've got until then to provide documentation. Otherwise, when I move the tanks, I'll be disconnecting those lines. There was a pause. Mr. Graham, the clubhouse relies on that propane connection for backup heating. We're heading into winter. Disconnecting that connection could leave the clubhouse without heat during an emergency. Then I suggest you get your own propane tanks, I said. Because I'm not paying to heat your building anymore. Gregory's tone shifted, becoming more conciliatory. Let's not be hasty. Perhaps we can reach some kind of arrangement. What if the HOA agrees to cover the cost of moving your tanks in exchange for maintaining the propane connection? The cost of moving the tanks plus $10,000 for back payment, I countered. That's excessive. I need to discuss this with the board. You've got until next week. I hung up feeling pretty satisfied with myself, but the satisfaction didn't last long. That evening, I found a new notice stuck to my front door. This one informed me that I was in violation of HOA rules regarding lawn maintenance, specifically that my grass was more than 4 inches high in several areas, and I had weeds visible in my garden beds. The notice demanded I correct these violations within 72 hours or face a $200 fine. I looked at my lawn. I had mowed it 3 days ago. There were maybe a couple of spots near the trees where the grass was a bit longer, but nothing unreasonable. And yes, I had some weeds in my garden beds, but no more than half the houses in the neighborhood. I took pictures of my lawn from every angle, then walked around the block taking pictures of other houses. At least a dozen properties had lawns that looked the same or worse than mine. I documented everything. The next day, I got another notice. This one was about my mailbox, which apparently was showing signs of rust and needed to be repainted or replaced within 2 weeks. The day after that, another notice about a tree branch that was allegedly hanging too far over the sidewalk. It was harassment, plain and simple. Wendy Wilkins was retaliating against me for standing up to her, and she was using her position on the HOA board to do it. I called David Chen again. They're burying me in violations. What can I do? Document everything, David said. Take pictures, keep records of when you receive each notice, and note whether other properties have similar issues that aren't being cited. This is starting to look like selective enforcement and retaliation, which could be relevant if this ends up in court. When this ends up in court, you mean? Probably, yeah. The week passed quickly. I spent most of it taking care of all the supposed violations Wendy kept finding. Not because I thought they were legitimate, but because I didn't want to give her any ammunition. I mowed my lawn to golf course standards, pulled every weed I could find, repainted my mailbox, and trimmed the tree branch. Randy and his crew showed up on Tuesday morning to move the tanks. I had taken the day off work to oversee the process. The first thing they did was drain the tanks and disconnect all the lines, including the unauthorized ones running to the clubhouse. Around 10 o'clock, Wendy Wilkins showed up in her Lexus, moving faster than I had ever seen her move. She practically jumped out of the car. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Moving my propane tanks just like the HOA ordered," I said calmly. "You can't disconnect that line to the clubhouse." "Actually, I can. It's my propane, my tanks, and that's an unauthorized connection." Wendy's face was turning red. "We have an agreement. Show it to me." "Our attorney is still looking for it." "Then I guess he better look faster." I turned to Randy. "Go ahead and disconnect everything." Wendy pulled out her phone and made a call, turning away so I couldn't hear clearly. A few minutes later, Gregory Porter, the HOA's attorney, called my phone. "Mr. Graham, please don't disconnect that line yet. We're still searching for the documentation." "You've had a week," I said. "These are old records. Some of them aren't digitized. We need more time." "How much time?" "Another week. Maybe 2, I thought about it." "Fine. I'll leave your line connected for now, but only if the HOA agrees in writing that they'll either produce the agreement or pay me for the propane they've been using. And the harassment stops immediately. No more bogus violations." There was silence on the other end. "I'll need to discuss this with the board. You've got 24 hours. Otherwise, Randy here is disconnecting everything right now." I hung up. Wendy was still standing there, looking like she wanted to explode but couldn't quite figure out what to say. "You're making a big mistake," she finally said. "Maybe," I replied, "but at least it's my mistake to make." The crew spent the rest of the day working on moving the tanks. They had to bring in a small crane to lift them, and it took hours to get the new concrete pad prepared and the tanks positioned correctly. By the time they finished running the new lines to my house, it was after 6 in the evening. "All set," Randy told me. "Your old tanks are in their new location, all hooked up and ready to go. And I left that line to the clubhouse connected like you asked, but I put a shut-off valve on it right at your tanks. If you need to disconnect them later, you just turn this valve. He showed me a bright red handle. Easy. I thanked him and paid the bill. $6,200, just like he had quoted. I had put it on my credit card, figuring I'd either get reimbursed by the HOA or end up taking them to court for it. That night, I got an email from Gregory Porter. The HOA board had agreed to my terms in principle, subject to a final vote at an emergency meeting they were scheduling for later that week. In the meantime, they agreed to stop issuing any new violations against my property, and they would continue searching for the documentation regarding the propane agreement. The emergency board meeting was held on Friday evening. This time, I brought David Chen with me. The community clubhouse was more crowded than I had ever seen it, with at least 50 residents in attendance. Word had gotten around about the propane situation, and people were curious. Wendy called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a presentation about a situation involving unauthorized disconnection of community utilities. She made it sound like I was the villain, trying to hold the HOA hostage by threatening to cut off heating to the clubhouse. When she finished, David stood up. "May I address the board?" Wendy looked like she wanted to say no, but Robert, the reasonable board member, spoke up. "I think we should hear from Mr. Graham's attorney." David walked to the front of the room and handed out copies of the propane company's report to each board member. Then he laid out the facts calmly and clearly. The tanks were on my property. I had been paying for all the propane. The HOA had been using my propane without my knowledge or consent for years. The HOA had then demanded I move the tanks, which would cost thousands of dollars, without offering any compensation for the propane they had taken or the expense of moving the tanks. And when Mr. Graham tried to resolve this reasonably, David continued, he was subjected to what appears to be retaliatory enforcement of minor violations that other properties don't get cited for. This is textbook harassment. Several residents in the audience started murmuring. Wendy banged her gavel, looking flustered. "That's completely inaccurate," she said. "The HOA has been operating in good faith throughout this entire process." "Then produce the agreement you claim exists," David said. "You've had 3 weeks now. Where is it?" Gregory Porter stood up. He looked uncomfortable. "We've conducted an extensive search of the HOA's records. I've personally reviewed files going back 20 years. I cannot locate any written agreement regarding the propane connection." The murmuring in the audience got louder. Wendy's face went pale. "However," Gregory continued, "it's possible that such an agreement existed but was never properly filed or was lost during the transition when the HOA changed management companies in 2015. Or it never existed in the first place," David said. "Which means the HOA has been stealing propane from my client for years." "That's a very serious accusation," Gregory said stiffly. "It's a serious situation," David replied. "My client is prepared to file a civil lawsuit for theft of services, plus damages for the harassment and selective enforcement. Unless, of course, the HOA would prefer to settle this matter reasonably." Wendy looked like she had been slapped. Robert leaned over and whispered something to her, and the board members huddled together for a few minutes of intense discussion. Finally, Wendy straightened up. "The board would like to propose a settlement," she said, her voice tight. "The HOA will reimburse Mr. Graham for the cost of moving his propane tanks. In exchange, Mr. Graham will agree to maintain the connection to the clubhouse for an additional 6 months while we arrange for our own propane system, and he will agree not to pursue any further claims against the HOA. What about reimbursement for the propane that's already been used?" I asked. Wendy hesitated. Robert leaned over and whispered to her again. She closed her eyes briefly, then nodded. The HOA will pay $5,000 toward past propane usage, she said. That's our final offer. I looked at David. He shrugged slightly, leaving the decision to me. I did the math in my head. $6,200 for moving the tanks, plus $5,000 for past propane, minus whatever the HOA might use over the next 6 months. It wasn't everything I could potentially get if I sued them, but it was close, and it would save me months of legal hassle. I want it in writing, I said. A formal settlement agreement that releases both parties from any claims related to this issue, and I want a check for the full amount within 30 days. Wendy looked at Gregory, who nodded. We can do that, she said. The board voted 4-1 to approve the settlement, with only Wendy voting against it. After the meeting, several residents came up to me to shake my hand and thank me for standing up to the board. Apparently, Wendy's aggressive enforcement style had been bothering a lot of people, and they were glad someone had finally pushed back. One older woman who introduced herself as Margaret pulled me aside. You know, Wendy is up for re-election next month, she said quietly. A lot of us are planning to vote for someone else. This whole situation has really opened our eyes about how she operates. Over the next few weeks, things settled down. David drew up the settlement agreement. Both sides signed it, and I received a check from the HOA for $11,200. The propane company installed a meter on the line running to the clubhouse so we could track exactly how much they were using, and the HOA agreed to pay me monthly for what they consumed. True to their word, the HOA hired a contractor to install their own propane system. It took longer than 6 months, closer to 8 actually, but I didn't mind. They were paying me for the propane they used, and there were no more harassment violations. The interesting thing was what happened at the HOA election. Wendy ran for re-election as board president, but she ended up losing badly. A retired engineer named Paul Garrison ran against her on a platform of fair enforcement and transparency, and he won by a landslide. Wendy was so upset that she ended up resigning from the board entirely and putting her house up for sale. Last I heard, she had moved to a different development in South Charlotte. Paul turned out to be a much better president. He implemented a policy requiring the board to apply violations consistently across all properties, with photographic documentation to show why someone was being cited. He also started publishing detailed financial reports and made all HOA documents easily accessible online. About a year after the whole propane incident, I ran into Robert at a neighborhood barbecue. He had stepped down from the board after Wendy left, saying he had done his time and wanted to enjoy retirement without HOA drama. You know, Robert said, nursing a beer, that whole situation with Wendy was crazy. I voted to approve your tanks being where they were originally, but she had the majority and there was only so much I could do. Why was she so aggressive about it? I asked. Robert shook his head. Power trip, mostly. She thought being HOA president meant she could run the neighborhood like her personal fiefdom, but there was also money involved. What do you mean? Wendy's husband owns a property management company, not the one we use, but a competitor. She was trying to make our current management company look bad, so she could push to switch to her husband's company. Part of that was showing that our neighborhood had lots of violations that weren't being enforced. Your propane tanks were just the most visible thing she could latch onto. That's pretty corrupt. Yeah, some of us suspected it, but we couldn't prove anything. After you stood up to her, other people started questioning her motives too. That's really what led to her losing the election. I thought about that conversation a lot over the following months. The whole experience had taught me several important lessons about HOAs and community living. The rules themselves weren't necessarily bad, but they could be weaponized by people who cared more about power and control than about actually serving the community. The propane situation also had an unexpected benefit. The clubhouse's new propane system was larger and more efficient than what they had been cobbling together with my tanks. When we had a major ice storm the following winter that knocked out power for 3 days, the clubhouse became an emergency warming center for residents. The backup generator and heating system ran perfectly, keeping the building warm and providing a safe place for families who couldn't heat their homes. Paul, the new HOA president, made a point of thanking me at the next board meeting, noting that the whole propane incident had led to a better emergency preparedness system for the community. It was a nice moment, and it helped me feel like maybe all the stress and confrontation had been worth it. As for my relationship with the HOA after that, things were generally peaceful. I kept my property maintained, followed the reasonable rules, and attended the occasional board meeting when there was something important to discuss. Paul ran the board professionally and fairly, and most of the drama that had characterized Wendy's tenure faded away. I did end up becoming friends with several of my neighbors through the whole experience. Tom, who lived next door, started coming over regularly to work on projects in my workshop. We rebuilt a vintage motorcycle together and had a great time doing it. Margaret, the woman who had told me about Wendy's re-election, invited me to join the Neighborhood Watch program, which turned out to be a good way to stay connected with what was happening in the community. There was one more twist to the story, though. About 18 months after the settlement, I got a call from a detective with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. His name was Detective Morrison, and he wanted to ask me some questions about Wendy Wilkins and the Meadowbrook Estates, HOA. We're investigating allegations of financial impropriety involving several HOAs in the Charlotte area, Detective Morrison explained when we met at a coffee shop. Your name came up in connection with Meadowbrook Estates. Can you tell me about your experience with the board? I gave him the whole story about the propane tanks, the harassment, and the eventual settlement. Detective Morrison took careful notes. Did you ever notice any other unusual financial activities or decisions by the board during Wendy Wilkins' tenure? He asked. Not really. I wasn't paying that close attention to HOA finances until the propane issue came up. What about other residents? Did anyone else complain about unusual enforcement or financial issues? I thought about it. There was another situation, now that you mention it. A woman named Sandra who lived on Oak Street got hit with a huge special assessment to repair her driveway. She thought it was excessive, but the board told her it was required by the HOA bylaws. She ended up paying it because she couldn't afford to fight them legally. Detective Morrison made a note. Do you remember approximately when this happened? Maybe 6 months before my propane issue, so about 2 years ago now. Thank you. That's helpful. I learned later that Detective Morrison was investigating a scheme involving multiple HOAs in the Charlotte area. Apparently, Wendy's husband's property management company had been colluding with certain HOA board members to inflate maintenance costs and special assessments, then pocketing the difference. Wendy had been trying to get her husband's company hired at Meadowbrook Estates as part of this scheme, which explained her aggressive enforcement tactics and desire to make the existing management company look bad. The investigation took about 6 months. In the end, Wendy's husband and 3 other people were charged with multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. Wendy herself was charged as an accessory for her role in trying to manipulate the Meadowbrook Estates board. The whole thing made the local news, and several residents from Meadowbrook Estates, including me, were interviewed about our experiences. The trial happened about a year later. Wendy's husband took a plea deal and received 3 years in prison plus restitution to the affected HOAs. Wendy also took a plea deal and received 2 years of probation and community service. Several of the other HOAs that had been affected filed civil lawsuits for additional damages. For Meadowbrook Estates specifically, the investigation revealed that Wendy had been planning to push for several expensive improvements that would have been contracted through her husband's companies at inflated prices. The propane tank situation with me had derailed those plans before they could really get started, which probably saved the community tens of thousands of dollars. Paul, who was still HOA president, thanked me again at a community meeting where we discussed the investigation results. "You standing up to Wendy probably saved this neighborhood from a lot of financial pain," he said. "Sometimes it takes one person refusing to back down to expose a much bigger problem." Looking back on the whole experience now, several years later, I'm glad I didn't just give in and move the tanks without questioning the situation. It would have been easier in the short term, sure. I could have avoided the stress, the legal fees, and all the confrontation. But sometimes the easy path isn't the right path. The situation taught me that HOAs, like any organization with power over people's lives, need to be held accountable. Rules and regulations are fine, but they need to be applied fairly and consistently, not used as weapons by people with personal agendas. And when you encounter someone who's abusing their authority, it's worth standing up to them, even if it's uncomfortable. These days, I still live in Meadowbrook Estates. My propane tanks sit on their new concrete pad, well within any reasonable interpretation of property boundaries. The HOA has its own propane system for the clubhouse. The neighborhood is peaceful and well-maintained. And every time I see those tanks, I think about the wild ride that led to them being where they are. I also think about Wendy Wilkins sometimes, and I wonder if she ever reflects on how things went so wrong. She started out, presumably, wanting to improve the neighborhood and make it a better place to live. But somewhere along the way, the power and the potential for financial gain corrupted that mission. She ended up hurting the very community she claimed to be serving. The whole experience also changed how I think about community involvement. Before the propane incident, I was pretty passive about HOA matters. I paid my dues, followed the rules, and didn't pay much attention to board meetings or elections. Now, I make a point of staying informed and involved. I read the meeting minutes, attend important meetings, and vote in elections. Because I learned that what happens at the HOA level can have a real impact on your daily life and your property value. My friendship with Tom, my neighbor, grew stronger through all of this too. He was one of the people who supported me throughout the whole ordeal, and he was happy to see Wendy get what was coming to her. Tom had his own run-in with Wendy early in her tenure, something about his garage door being the wrong color. She had backed down when Tom pushed back, but the experience had left a bad taste in his mouth. "You know what the best part of that whole thing was?" Tom said one evening while we were working on the motorcycle in my workshop. "Watching Wendy's face when the board voted for the settlement. She looked like she had bitten into a lemon." I laughed. I was more focused on making sure I got that agreement in writing. I didn't trust her not to try something else. Smart move. She would have found a way to weasel out of it if she could have. The motorcycle project took us about 6 months to complete. It was a 1972 Honda CB 750, a classic bike that Tom had bought as a basket case for $500. We rebuilt the engine, replaced the electrical system, restored the bodywork, and got it running beautifully. When we finally took it out for its first real ride, cruising through the back roads of North Carolina on a perfect spring afternoon, I felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with HOAs or property disputes. Life has a way of moving forward, even after dramatic events. The propane incident became a story I told at parties, usually with some embellishment for comedic effect. New residents moved into the neighborhood who had never heard of Wendy Wilkins and didn't know about the drama that had unfolded. The community kept evolving, with new families and new challenges and new opportunities. I did eventually run into Wendy one more time, about 3 years after everything had happened. I was at a home improvement store in South Charlotte, loading bags of mulch into my truck, when I saw her in the parking lot. She was getting out of a more modest car than the Lexus she used to drive, and she looked older and more tired than I remembered. Our eyes met for a moment. I wasn't sure what to say. Part of me wanted to just ignore her and drive away, but another part of me was curious about how she was doing, what her life looked like now after everything had fallen apart. I nodded at her. She nodded back, hesitated, and then walked over. "Patrick," she said. Her voice was different now, quieter, without that sharp edge of authority it used to have. "Wendy," I replied. There was an awkward silence. Then she said, "I owe you an apology for how I handled things with the propane tanks, for everything, really. I was wrong. I hadn't expected that." "Okay," I said, not sure what else to say. "I let the power go to my head," Wendy continued. "I thought being HOA president meant I was important, that I could make things happen. And my husband, he convinced me that we could make some money on the side, that it wasn't really hurting anyone. But it was wrong. All of it was wrong." "Yeah, it was," I said. "There didn't seem to be any point in sugarcoating it. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I wanted to say it." I looked at her for a long moment. She seemed genuine, beaten down by the consequences of her actions, but maybe learning from them. "I appreciate you saying that," I finally said. "I hope things get better for you." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes, and walked back to her car without another word. I drove home thinking about that encounter. It's easy to demonize people who wrong us, to think of them as purely bad or malicious, but reality is more complicated than that. Wendy had made terrible choices, and she had paid a heavy price for them. She had hurt people and deserved the consequences she faced. But she was still a human being, capable of regret and maybe even growth. That didn't mean I forgave her completely, or that I thought her apology erased what she had done. But it did give me some closure, a sense that the whole situation had reached a proper ending. The Meadowbrook Estates community continued to thrive under Paul's leadership, and then under subsequent board presidents who followed his example of fairness and transparency. The neighborhood became known as one of the better-managed HOAs in Charlotte, which probably helped property values. My house, which I had bought for $230,000 in 2018, was worth close to $400,000 by 2025. I never did end up moving out of Meadowbrook Estates. Some people might think I would want to leave after all the drama with the HOA, but actually, the experience made me more invested in the community. I had fought for my right to live there on my own terms, and that gave me a sense of ownership that went beyond just holding the deed to my property. I also got more involved in community activities. I joined the Architectural Review Committee, which was responsible for approving changes to homes like additions or exterior renovations. I figured my experience with the propane situation gave me a good perspective on how to balance community standards with individual property rights. I made sure we applied rules fairly and consistently, and that we took the time to listen to residents' concerns rather than just rubber-stamping decisions. Serving on that committee gave me a lot of respect for the difficulty of managing an HOA. There are always competing interests, limited resources, and people who are unhappy about something. The key is to try to be fair, transparent, and willing to listen. Not everyone is going to be happy all the time, but most people will accept decisions they disagree with if they feel like the process was fair and their voice was heard. One of the most satisfying aspects of serving on the committee was helping prevent situations like what I had gone through. When disputes came up, I always encouraged people to gather documentation, understand their rights, and communicate clearly. Sometimes that meant supporting residents against the HOA when the HOA was overreaching. Other times, it meant helping residents understand why certain rules existed and how they benefited the community. The propane tanks themselves continued to serve me well in their new location. They were farther from my house, which was a minor inconvenience, but they were also in a spot with better drainage and easier access for the delivery truck. The propane company commented several times that the new location was actually better from a safety and logistics standpoint. And every time I looked at those tanks, I was reminded that sometimes standing up for yourself, even when it's difficult and uncomfortable, is the right thing to do. Not because you want to be difficult or because you enjoy conflict, but because principles matter. Property rights matter. Fairness matters. And when someone with authority tries to abuse that authority, pushing back isn't just about protecting yourself. It's about protecting everyone else who might be targeted next. The story of the propane tanks became something of a legend in Meadowbrook Estates. New residents would hear about it from longtime residents, usually in the context of explaining why the current HOA board was so focused on fairness and transparency. It became a cautionary tale about what happens when HOA boards lose sight of their purpose and start serving personal interests instead of community interests. Tom and I finished that motorcycle restoration and ended up starting a small side business doing custom motorcycle work. Nothing huge, just a few bikes a year for enthusiasts who appreciated quality craftsmanship. It was satisfying work, and it gave me a creative outlet outside of my regular engineering job. The workshop behind my house, the one that had been heated by those propane tanks all along, became a hub of activity. We specialized in vintage Japanese bikes from the 1970s and 1980s, the golden era of motorcycles as far as we were concerned. There was something deeply satisfying about taking a neglected, broken machine and bringing it back to life, making it better than it had been originally. In some ways, it was a metaphor for what had happened with the HOA after Wendy left. The community had been broken by her self-serving leadership, but it had been restored to something better than before. I'm not going to pretend that everything was perfect after the propane incident. Life doesn't work that way. There were still occasional disputes with neighbors, still HOA decisions I disagreed with, still the normal friction that comes from living in a community with rules and regulations. But the fundamental dynamics had changed. The HOA operated more transparently, more fairly, and with more respect for individual property rights. Paul served as president for 4 years before stepping down. His successor, a woman named Linda Martinez who worked as a CPA, continued his policies and added even more financial oversight to prevent any future corruption. She implemented quarterly financial reviews and required competitive bidding for all contracts over $5,000. The community was in good hands. As for me, I continued living my life in Meadowbrook Estates. I dated occasionally, though I never quite found someone I wanted to marry. I advanced in my engineering career, eventually becoming a project manager at my firm. I kept working on motorcycles with Tom. I stayed involved with the HOA, serving on committees and voting in elections. And I kept those propane tanks filled, using them to heat my workshop and my water and to fuel my grill. They sat on their concrete pad, with their bright red shut-off valve, a permanent reminder of the time I stood up to an HOA president who thought she could push me around. The funny thing is, if Wendy had approached the situation differently from the start, if she had been honest about the propane connection and offered to compensate me fairly, I probably would have agreed to move the tanks without much fuss. I'm a reasonable person. I understand that sometimes things need to change to serve the greater good, but she didn't do that. She tried to bully me, to use her authority to force me into compliance without explanation or compensation. And then, when I pushed back, she doubled down with harassment and retaliation. That's what turned a simple property dispute into a full-blown conflict that eventually exposed a criminal enterprise. Looking back, I can see that the propane tank incident was a turning point not just for me, but for the entire Meadowbrook Estates community. It forced residents to pay attention to how their HOA was being run. It led to leadership changes that improved the community, and it helped prevent what could have been a much more serious financial fraud that would have cost homeowners tens of thousands of dollars. Sometimes the smallest things can have the biggest consequences. 2 propane tanks sitting on a concrete pad, minding their own business. Who would have thought they could cause so much trouble and ultimately lead to so much positive change? These days, when I talk to residents who are dealing with HOA issues in other communities, I always give them the same advice. Document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to stand up for yourself when the situation calls for it. But also try to resolve things reasonably first. Most conflicts can be resolved through communication and compromise if both sides are acting in good faith. The problem comes when one side isn't acting in good faith, when someone is abusing their authority or pursuing personal gain at the expense of the community. That's when you need to be willing to fight back, to expose what's happening, and to hold people accountable. My experience with the propane tanks taught me that I was capable of standing up to authority when necessary. It gave me confidence that has served me well in other areas of my life. When my employer tried to pass me over for a promotion I deserved, I pushed back and made my case, and I got the promotion. When a contractor tried to overcharge me for work on my house, I called him out on it and negotiated a fair price. The propane incident showed me that I didn't have to just accept unfair treatment, that I could advocate for myself effectively. It also taught me about the importance of community. I couldn't have won that fight alone. I needed David Chen's legal expertise, Randy's documentation from the propane company, Robert's inside information about the board's dynamics, and the support of neighbors like Tom and Margaret. When you stand up to authority, having people in your corner makes all the difference. The settlement money I received from the HOA covered the cost of moving the tanks and compensated me for the stolen propane, but it also funded some improvements to my property. I used part of it to upgrade my workshop with better tools and equipment, which enabled Tom and me to take on more complex motorcycle restoration projects. I also put some money into landscaping, creating a nice garden area that became a peaceful retreat. Years passed, and the propane tank story gradually faded from being news to being history to being just another part of the community's lore. New challenges arose, new board members were elected, new residents moved in. Life went on as it always does. But I never forgot the lessons I learned from that experience. And I never took for granted the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it would be easier to just go along with whatever authority figures demand. Because at the end of the day, your home is your castle, your property is your property, and you have a right to defend both from overreach and abuse. The propane tanks still sit on their concrete pad, still fill and heat and serve their purpose. They're just tanks, just metal containers full of pressurized gas. But to me, they represent something more. They represent the principle that you don't have to accept unfair treatment just because someone has authority over you. They represent the power of standing up for yourself and your rights. And they represent the truth that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can lead to the biggest positive changes. That's the story of how an HOA demanded I move my propane tanks, and how complying with that demand ended up cutting off their backup heating supply and exposing a criminal conspiracy. It's a story about property rights, community governance, standing up to authority, and the unexpected consequences of small actions. And it's a story that I'm proud to tell, because it reminds me that ordinary people can make a difference when they are willing to stand up for what's right.